We often feel entirely secure when sealed inside a locked room, much like a first-class train carriage. But such isolation can quickly become a deadly trap. In August 1864, a young man stepped onto the bustling New York docks, breathing a sigh of relief. He believed his dark crimes remained across the ocean. Yet, waiting in the shadows were not local police, but London detectives who had tracked him for weeks. How did a locked room murder on an English railway ignite the greatest transatlantic manhunt of the Victorian era? Hello and welcome to the channel. To understand how this transatlantic chase began, we must rewind the clock back exactly 1 month before the docks of New York ever came into play. It was the evening of July 9, 1864, in the heart of a rapidly industrializing London. At 9:50 p.m., a steam locomotive hissed loudly, billowing thick black smoke into the night air at Fenchurch Street Station, preparing for its routine journey eastward toward Hackney. Boarding this train was 69-year-old Thomas Briggs, a respected chief clerk at the prestigious London Bank of Robarts, Curtis & Co. After enjoying a pleasant dinner with his niece in Peckham, Briggs was simply making his usual commute home. He carried his customary gold pocket watch attached to a heavy gold chain and wore his gold-rimmed spectacles, projecting the quiet, unassuming dignity of an affluent Victorian gentleman. He stepped into a first-class carriage, expecting nothing more than a peaceful, uneventful 20-minute ride through the dark city. But travel in the mid-19th century was fundamentally different from the interconnected commuter trains we know today. A Victorian first-class train carriage was undoubtedly luxurious, lined with plush leather upholstery, polished mahogany wood, and heavy, light-blocking curtains. Yet, by its very design, it was a completely isolated wooden box. There were no internal corridors connecting the different compartments. Once the conductor slammed the heavy door shut and the train was in motion, passengers were entirely sealed off from the rest of the train and the outside world. If you were sitting inside, the deafening roar of the coal-fired steam engine, the aggressive clattering of iron wheels on the tracks, and the rushing wind whistling through the gaps would easily drown out any sound. You could scream at the top of your lungs, fighting for your life, and the passengers sitting just inches away in the very next compartment wouldn't hear a single thing. It was a space that offered the illusion of absolute privacy, but in reality, it offered zero protection. The journey from Fenchurch Street to Hackney was swift. When the train finally hissed to a halt at Hackney Station, 2 young bank clerks, hoping to find a comfortable seat for the remainder of the journey, approached the first-class section. They turned the brass handle and pulled open the heavy wooden door to one of the compartments. What they saw inside made them freeze in absolute horror. The compartment was entirely empty of passengers, but it looked like the site of a frenzied slaughter. Fresh, dark blood was smeared wildly across the plush leather cushions. It pooled heavily on the wooden floorboards and dripped down the interior window glass in thick, macabre streaks. A heavy walking stick, stained with blood, lay discarded on the seat alongside a crushed, unfamiliar black beaver hat. It was a scene of sheer, unfiltered brutality, yet the victim was nowhere to be found inside the locked room. As the panicked clerks alerted the station master and chaos erupted on the platform, a far more grim discovery was being made miles down the dark railway line. A railway worker, slowly inspecting the tracks between Bow and Hackney with his dim oil lantern, stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Lying crumpled between the iron rails, bleeding heavily onto the gravel, was the broken body of an elderly man. It was Thomas Briggs. He had been brutally bludgeoned, his skull fractured in several places from heavy, merciless blows that were intended to kill. Incredibly, despite his catastrophic head injuries and the trauma of having been violently thrown from a moving train, Briggs was still faintly breathing. He was immediately rushed to a nearby tavern, which often served as a makeshift emergency room in those days, where surgeons desperately tried to save his life through the night. But the mechanics of the crime baffled everyone who looked at the blood-soaked carriage. Thomas Briggs was known to be a relatively robust and healthy man for his age, not someone who could be easily overpowered without a fierce struggle. Yet he had been beaten, robbed, and violently tossed out into the dark night. Even more inexplicably, when the train arrived at Hackney, the heavy door to the carriage was found firmly shut and secured from the outside. The detectives of Scotland Yard were suddenly faced with an impossible question. How did a ruthless killer brutally attack a man, throw his lifeless body onto the tracks, and somehow vanish into thin air from a locked compartment on a speeding train? Despite the frantic, desperate efforts of the medical men summoned to the dark railway tracks, the horrific trauma inflicted upon the victim's skull proved far too severe for Victorian medicine to mend. Thomas Briggs, the respected 69-year-old chief clerk at the prestigious banking firm of Robarts, Curtis & Co., succumbed to his devastating injuries shortly after his battered body was discovered. He never regained consciousness to name his attacker. Almost overnight, the gruesome details of the assault bled onto the front pages of every major newspaper across the nation. Publications like The Times and the Illustrated London News scrambled to report the horrific event, printing sensationalized, intensely graphic accounts of the blood-soaked compartment. The sheer, unprovoked brutality of the assault shocked a society that had, until that very moment, viewed the rapidly expanding railway network as the pinnacle of modern engineering and civilized, orderly travel. Death had arrived on the tracks, and it had chosen a wealthy, unassuming banker as its first prominent victim. What truly gripped the public consciousness and fueled the ensuing mass hysteria, however, was not merely the violence of the act itself, but the chilling realization of the precise environment where it had occurred. This was officially the first recorded murder on the British railway system, and it fundamentally shattered the fragile illusion of safety enjoyed by the affluent. The upper and middle classes, who routinely commuted from the suburbs to the financial heart of the city, suddenly realized that their expensive first-class tickets did not purchase security, but rather absolute, inescapable isolation. These luxurious carriages were effectively rolling locked rooms, entirely compartmentalized with no internal corridors, no walkways, and crucially, no communication cords to alert the driver or the guards. Gentlemen commuters were suddenly acutely aware that they could be sealed inside a narrow, soundproofed wooden box with a complete stranger for the duration of their journey. If a sudden, violent struggle ensued, the deafening, rhythmic roar of the steam engine and the relentless clatter of iron wheels against the tracks would easily drown out any desperate cries for help. Was the daily commute now a deadly gamble? A profound sense of claustrophobic panic swept through the population, leaving an indelible mark on the psychological landscape of public transport. As the initial wave of public terror crested, the methodical detectives of Scotland Yard stepped into the fray, meticulously cataloguing the blood-splattered interior of the Hackney carriage to piece together the sequence of events and deduce a motive. It quickly became evident to the investigators that this was not a random act of madness, but a calculated, cold-blooded robbery that had escalated into savage, uncontained violence. Briggs' pockets and clothing had been thoroughly and hastily ransacked during the frantic struggle in the dimly lit compartment. His expensive gold pocket watch, which had been securely attached to his waistcoat by a distinctive heavy gold Albert chain, was notably missing. Furthermore, his gold-rimmed spectacles, an item the elderly gentleman was known to always carry on his person, had vanished completely from the scene. The attacker had brutally bludgeoned the defenseless banker with a heavy, blunt instrument solely for these valuable trinkets before hauling his bleeding, unconscious body to the heavy carriage door and callously hurling him out into the unforgiving darkness of the railway line. Yet, in the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled haste of the escape, the ruthless assailant had made a singular, catastrophic error. When the killer fled into the night, desperate to distance himself from the butchery, he had mistakenly snatched up the high-quality silk top hat belonging to Thomas Briggs. Left behind, abandoned on the blood-stained floorboards of the first-class compartment, was the murderer's own headwear. It was a cheap, mass-produced black beaver hat, noticeably distinct from the refined, expensive garments typically worn by a gentleman of Briggs's high social standing. Upon closer microscopic inspection, beneath the gas lamps of the police station, investigators noted a peculiar, highly specific alteration. The crown of the hat had been clumsily cut down and stitched back together, likely to reduce its height in a crude, amateurish attempt to modernize its appearance. This heavily worn, modified black beaver hat, with its rough interior lining, was starkly and undeniably out of place in the luxurious confines of the first-class cabin. In the summer of 1864, law enforcement operated in a vastly different world. There were no digital fingerprint databases to consult, no forensic DNA testing to analyze the sweat left on a hatband, and certainly no network of surveillance cameras to track a fleeing shadow through the labyrinthine streets of London. The detectives of Scotland Yard stood on the cold platform, with nothing but a heavily blood-soaked train carriage and a remarkably cheap, badly altered black beaver hat. Would this single, unremarkable piece of felt be enough to identify a phantom who had vanished seamlessly into the teeming millions of the Victorian metropolis? Could a mere hat hang a man? This seemingly insignificant item of clothing was about to become the most critical, heavily scrutinized piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation. And against all odds, it was destined to trigger the most extraordinary, relentless, and unprecedented transatlantic manhunt the British Empire had ever witnessed. The formidable detectives of Scotland Yard, faced with a baffling locked-room mystery and an alarming lack of traditional forensic avenues, were forced to pin the entirety of their hopes upon a single, unimpressive piece of physical evidence. They zeroed in on the solitary, misshapen black beaver hat that had been carelessly abandoned upon the blood-stained floorboards of the carriage. Recognizing that this crude, heavily worn garment was the only tangible link to a phantom killer who had otherwise vanished without a trace, the authorities authorized an unprecedented investigative maneuver. In a desperate bid for public assistance, they circulated a highly detailed description and a precise sketch of the distinctively altered hat to the national press, hoping that someone in the sprawling, anonymous metropolis of London might recognize its peculiar cut. The widespread dissemination of this crucial clue soon yielded its first significant breakthrough from a highly respectable, yet entirely unexpected, quarter. A prominent local jeweler named John Death presented himself to the investigating officers, bearing a piece of information that would dramatically shift the trajectory of the case. He calmly recounted a highly suspicious transaction that had occurred in his shop shortly after the brutal murder of the banking clerk. A nervous young man, notably speaking with a thick, unmistakable German accent, had hurriedly entered the premises to exchange a heavy, distinctive gold Albert chain for a significantly cheaper gold ring. When the detectives meticulously examined the discarded chain, the grieving family of Thomas Briggs positively and instantly identified it as the very heirloom the elderly gentleman had worn on that fateful, deadly night. Could a simple, careless exchange of stolen jewelry in broad daylight be the fatal misstep that unraveled a murderer's perfect escape? The investigative net began to tighten considerably when a second, even more compelling witness emerged from the labyrinthine, fog-choked streets of the city. Jonathan Matthews, a working-class cab driver with a sharp eye for detail, had been casually perusing the evening newspaper when his gaze locked onto the detailed illustration of the murderer's headwear. A chilling, undeniable realization washed over him as he recognized the amateurish stitching and the unnaturally shortened crown. Matthews immediately summoned the police, providing a sworn, detailed statement that he personally knew the exact origins of that clumsily altered black beaver hat. In a bizarre and deeply unsettling twist of fate, the cabman revealed that he himself had purchased that specific hat some time ago. More damningly, he testified that he had recently gifted it to a young, impoverished German immigrant who had been aggressively and somewhat unwelcomely courting his eldest daughter. Suddenly, the faceless, brutal phantom of the first-class carriage had been given a concrete name, a specific profession, and a highly visible identity. The prime suspect was definitively identified as Franz Müller, a 24-year-old journeyman tailor who had been struggling to scrape together a meager living in the unforgiving, highly competitive economic climate of Victorian London. Armed with this definitive identification and a solid chain of circumstantial evidence linking him directly to the victim's stolen property and the weaponized environment of the train, the authorities swiftly secured a formal warrant for his arrest. The detectives were supremely confident that the ruthless killer of Thomas Briggs was finally cornered and would soon be brought to face the uncompromising justice of the British courts. However, when a heavily armed contingent of determined officers descended upon Müller's cramped, dismal lodgings in the East End, fully prepared to violently apprehend the dangerous fugitive, they were met only with silence. They found the small, rented room entirely stripped of his meager personal belongings, the bed cold and the wardrobe empty. The elusive German tailor had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but dust in his wake. A frantic, exhaustive search of his known associates, local public houses, and busy transport hubs quickly revealed a devastating, horrifying truth. Franz Müller had not simply relocated to another impoverished borough within the city to hide, but had decisively and cleanly fled the country. Shipping records, meticulously checked by the investigators, indicated that the young man had hastily purchased a one-way passage aboard a massive, wooden sailing vessel bearing the name Victoria. The Victoria had already slipped its heavy moorings and departed the bustling London docks several days prior to the police raid, setting a direct, unalterable course for the distant shores of the United States. In an era completely devoid of wireless telegraphy, commercial aviation, or any form of rapid international communication, a ship at sea was effectively an untouchable, impenetrable fortress. As the great white sails of the Victoria billowed across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a grim, suffocating realization settled over the frustrated detectives of Scotland Yard. Had this unassuming, ruthless young tailor just committed the perfect, untraceable crime, successfully escaping the long arm of British law to vanish forever into the endless, anonymous promise of America? The investigation had abruptly hit a seemingly impenetrable wall of geography and time. In the mid-19th century, the Atlantic Ocean was not merely a body of water. It was a vast, silent void that effectively swallowed communication, commerce, and fugitives alike. Once a wooden passenger vessel like the Victoria slipped beyond the misty horizon of the English coast, it vanished entirely from the reach of traditional law enforcement. There were no functioning transatlantic telegraph cables yet capable of transmitting a warning to the American authorities, and certainly no international police databases or radio signals to flag a fleeing suspect. Franz Müller was adrift on a slow, wind-powered island, safely suspended in a legal no-man's land between the horrific scene of his crime and his promised sanctuary. The deeply frustrating dilemma facing Scotland Yard was entirely unprecedented in the annals of criminal history. How exactly does one apprehend a ruthless murderer who is already hundreds of miles out to sea, heavily insulated by millions of gallons of churning saltwater? It was the sharp, highly innovative mind of Inspector Richard Tanner that recognized a slender, extraordinary window of opportunity. Tanner quickly realized that the Victoria was a traditional sailing ship, heavily burdened by its cargo and passengers, and entirely at the merciful, unpredictable whims of the Atlantic trade winds. If the weather turned foul, or worse, if the winds simply died, the vessel would languish for weeks. Britain, however, was currently in the explosive throes of a mechanical revolution. Inspector Tanner made a bold, deeply calculated decision to leverage the absolute pinnacle of modern engineering against the ancient, unreliable power of the wind. He immediately petitioned his superiors and secured rapid passage on an entirely different kind of vessel, the City of Washington, a state-of-the-art, coal-fired steamship. This was no longer just a standard criminal pursuit. It had rapidly evolved into a high-stakes, transatlantic race, pitting the unpredictable forces of nature against the relentless, pounding rhythm of the industrial age, knowing full well that an arrest on foreign sovereign soil would require irrefutable, immediate proof of identity to satisfy the American courts. Inspector Tanner could not afford to make the perilous journey alone. He hastily assembled a highly unusual pursuit team, legally compelling both John Death, the observant jeweler, and Jonathan Matthews, the sharp-eyed cab driver, to abandon their livelihoods and accompany him across the treacherous ocean. The voyage aboard the City of Washington was a tense, smoke-filled, and grueling ordeal. As the heavy steamship violently cut through the grey rolling swells of the Atlantic, the deafening, rhythmic thumping of its massive iron engines served as a constant, anxiety-inducing metronome. Tanner spent the turbulent journey pacing the wooden decks, plagued by the agonizing uncertainty of their desperate endeavor. What if the Victoria had caught an exceptionally strong, favorable gale? What if the cunning German tailor had somehow suspected pursuit and planned a mutiny, or intended to quietly slip away at a different port entirely? The monumental, expensive gamble of steam over sail ultimately paid off with astonishing historical success. When the City of Washington finally steamed into the bustling, chaotic harbor of New York, Tanner and his weary civilian witnesses discovered a spectacular triumph. They had not only beaten the fleeing suspect across the ocean, but they had arrived a staggering 3 weeks ahead of him. The London detectives now faced a grueling, psychological test of patience in a rapidly expanding foreign land. They quietly embedded themselves in the sprawling American port, collaborating meticulously with the local New York authorities and diplomats to prepare the unprecedented, highly complex extradition paperwork. Day after day, as thousands of European immigrants poured onto the loud, crowded docks seeking a new life amidst the bloody backdrop of the ongoing American Civil War, Inspector Tanner stood vigilantly in the shadows, his eyes fixed firmly on the eastern horizon, waiting for a ghost ship to slowly materialize from the fog. This incredible sequence of events brings us perfectly back to the gripping scene at the very beginning of our story. On a humid day in late August 1864, the exhausted, weather-beaten Victoria finally dropped its heavy iron anchor in the bustling New York harbor. As the weary passengers slowly began to disembark, a young, unassuming man stepped onto the wooden docks, taking a deep, triumphant breath of the new world's air. He firmly believed he had successfully outrun his dark past and forever escaped the looming shadow of the London gallows. Yet, in a display of staggering, almost incomprehensible arrogance, he was brazenly carrying Thomas Briggs' stolen gold watch in his pocket. Even more damning, perched proudly atop his head, was the murdered banker's exquisite silk top hat, which the impoverished tailor had meticulously cut down and restitched during the long, idle weeks at sea to fit his own skull. Before Müller could even take his first confident step into his new, free life, Inspector Richard Tanner stepped out from the cool shadows of the customs house. With the jeweler and the cabman standing silently behind him to provide absolute confirmation, Tanner placed a firm, heavy hand on the stunned tailor's shoulder, effectively concluding the greatest, most technologically advanced transatlantic manhunt of the Victorian era right there on the sun-drenched American docks. The extradition of Franz Müller was a highly complex, fiercely negotiated, and entirely unprecedented legal maneuver that essentially drafted the modern blueprint for international criminal cooperation across the Atlantic. Once the American magistrates were sufficiently convinced by the undeniable physical presence of the stolen gold Albert chain and the conspicuously altered beaver hat, the young German tailor was heavily shackled, stripped of his brief illusion of freedom, and forced onto a transatlantic steamship bound directly for the very city he had so desperately tried to escape. The grueling journey back across the ocean must have been a period of suffocating dread for the suspect, locked below decks as the churning engine propelled him toward his inevitable reckoning. When the vessel finally docked back on English soil, the sheer, unbridled scale of the public outrage became terrifyingly clear to the escorting detectives. Thousands of furious, screaming Londoners swarmed the damp docks and densely lined the cobblestone streets, their faces contorted in collective anger, all desperate to catch a fleeting glimpse of the notorious railway murderer. This was no longer just a routine criminal case. It had transformed into a ravenous national obsession, a visceral, deeply emotional reaction to the violent violation of their supposedly safe, modern commuter sanctuaries. In the damp, fog-choked November of 1864, the highly anticipated trial officially commenced within the gloomy, imposing, heavily wood-panelled walls of the Old Bailey, London's central criminal court. The prosecution methodically presented a meticulous, chronological chain of events, carefully tracking the movement of the stolen jewelry through the hands of the jeweler and highlighting the damning testimony of the cab driver regarding the swapped hats. However, Müller's defense barrister mounted a fierce, highly logical, and remarkably modern counterattack, hinging his entire argument on the glaring, undeniable lack of direct eyewitnesses to the gruesome crime in the dark carriage. He passionately reminded the packed, breathless courtroom that every single piece of evidence presented by the esteemed detectives of Scotland Yard was purely circumstantial, requiring significant leaps of deductive logic to tie the man to the actual moment of death. He then dramatically directed the jury's attention to the stark physical disparity between the two men. Did a slight, undernourished 24-year-old immigrant tailor truly possess the sheer brute physical force required to relentlessly batter a robust 69-year-old bank chief clerk to the brink of death? Could he have then managed to pry open a heavy carriage door against the immense, rushing wind pressure of a steam train moving at high velocity and hurl the heavy, unconscious body out onto the iron tracks? It was a powerful seed of reasonable doubt, carefully planted in a judicial era that traditionally demanded absolute, irrefutable certainty before condemning a man to the gallows. Yet, the mounting, unchecked terror of the Victorian commuting public actively demanded a swift, decisive resolution, and the circumstantial web so expertly woven by Inspector Tanner was simply too tight to break. It took the somber, tight-lipped jury a mere 15 minutes of hushed deliberation to return to the tense courtroom with a unanimous, devastating verdict: guilty of willful murder. The presiding judge, solemnly draping the traditional, dreaded, black square of silk over his wig, sentenced Franz Müller to death by hanging. What followed on a freezing, miserable morning shortly after the trial concluded was a horrifying spectacle of human depravity that would soon be permanently erased from civilized British society. A massive, chaotic crowd of over 50,000 people, comprising wealthy gentlemen, working-class laborers, and even young children clutching their parents' hands, surged around the imposing, grim stone walls outside the debtor's door of Newgate Prison. The atmosphere was a grotesque carnival of the macabre, filled with deafening shouts, drunken brawls, and the relentless, suffocating pressing of bodies, all eagerly gathered to witness one of the very last public executions in the long, bloody history of the English penal system. As the condemned, pale-faced tailor was slowly and unsteadily led up the wooden steps of the imposing public scaffold, the deafening roar of the massive crowd momentarily dulled into a tense, breathless, expectant hum. Müller stood violently trembling on the fatal wooden trapdoor, the rough, heavy hemp rope being securely and methodically adjusted around his neck by the veteran executioner. In those agonizing, terrifying final seconds, suspended between the realm of the living and the abyss of eternity, a German-speaking Lutheran minister, Dr. Louis Capel, leaned in agonizingly close to the doomed man's ear. He passionately pleaded with Müller one last time, desperately urging him not to step into the afterlife with a heavy, unconfessed lie upon his immortal soul. For weeks, from the sun-drenched docks of New York to the freezing cells of Newgate, the young tailor had steadfastly and repeatedly maintained his absolute innocence against all accusations. But there, with the dark canvas hood about to descend over his eyes and the wooden release lever firmly gripped by the executioner's hand, the immense psychological dam finally broke. In his native tongue, his voice barely rising above a broken, desperate whisper, Müller finally uttered the chilling, historic words: "Ich habe es getan, I did it." Seconds later, the heavy trapdoor crashed open with a sickening thud, and the hangman's rope snapped taut, abruptly ending the life of the first railway murderer. The ruthless, opportunistic killer had finally paid the ultimate irreversible price upon the heavy wooden gallows, and justice, at least in the strict eyes of Victorian law, had been unequivocally served. But the gruesome execution of Franz Müller did absolutely nothing to quell the deep, paralyzing anxiety that had permanently infected the psyche of the British commuting public. The immediate physical threat had been extinguished at the end of a rope, but the horrific, lingering realization of their own profound vulnerability remained deeply entrenched. The terrifying phantom of the locked room murder continued to violently haunt the minds of millions of everyday citizens who relied upon the rapidly expanding railway network for their daily survival. If a wealthy, highly respected gentleman could be brutally slaughtered in a supposedly secure, premium cabin, how could anyone ever dare to step onto a train, sit nervously across from a silent stranger, and listen to the heavy wooden door click firmly shut once again? Although Franz Müller had met his end at the gallows, the profound terror he instilled in the travelling public refused to die with him. The Victorian commuter could no longer look at a locked first-class carriage as a haven of luxury and quiet isolation. Instead, it was widely perceived as a suffocating, inescapable death trap. Passengers became so paranoid that businessmen reportedly began carrying loaded revolvers and heavy walking sticks just to endure their daily commutes. To quell this unprecedented public hysteria, railway companies were forced to permanently alter the architectural design of their train cars. They began cutting small, circular holes into the thick wooden partitions that separated the private compartments, fitting them with sturdy glass panes. These rudimentary peepholes allowed passengers to peer into the adjacent carriages, creating a system of mutual surveillance. Almost immediately, the grim and cynical public dubbed these observation windows Müller's lights, a dark, enduring tribute to the young tailor who had successfully shattered the illusion of railway safety. However, a simple pane of glass was merely a psychological comfort, not a physical safeguard. If a passenger witnessed a brutal attack unfolding through one of Müller's lights, they were still entirely powerless to stop the speeding train or summon the guards over the deafening roar of the steam engine. The horrific, preventable fate of Thomas Briggs served as the direct legislative catalyst for a far more crucial engineering invention. The British government quickly passed the Regulation of Railways Act, which legally mandated that every passenger train must be equipped with a functional alarm system. This was the immediate birth of the emergency communication cord, a direct mechanical link running the length of the train to the engineer's cabin, designed specifically to halt the locomotive in the event of a violent assault. It was a revolutionary safety feature born directly from a brutal tragedy, and it permanently transformed the landscape of public transportation worldwide. More than a century and a half has passed since that fatal summer evening in 1864, and the world of rail travel has evolved beyond recognition. The smoke-belching steam engines have been replaced by sleek, high-speed electric rails, and those isolated, locked wooden compartments are now little more than museum relics. Yet, the grim legacy of this pioneering locked room mystery continues to quietly ride alongside us on every single journey. The next time you find yourself sitting on a desolate, dimly lit train carriage late at night, and your eyes happen to drift up toward that bright red emergency pull cord resting silently on the wall, Take a moment to reflect on its true origins. It is not just a standard, modern piece of bureaucratic safety equipment. It is hanging there solely because of the spilled blood of a 69-year-old banker, a man viciously beaten and tossed out into the pitch-black void of a Victorian night. What are your thoughts on this unprecedented transatlantic manhunt and the desperate race against a sailing ship? If you had been a Scotland Yard detective standing inside that blood-soaked first-class carriage, do you think you would have immediately recognized the crucial significance of an altered, cheap beaver hat left behind at the scene? Let me know your personal theories and historical insights down in the comments below. If you enjoyed tracing the footsteps of this landmark investigation, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. Join me next time as we unlock yet another chilling, forgotten murder file from the dusty archives of the past.